Thank you for having me, Cherie, to this important event. It's an honor to participate. The title of my presentation is The Fabrication of a History, Palestinian Historical Revisionism, and the Undermining of the Jewish Connection to the Land. We have a lot to cover, so I will just jump right into it. The unprecedented surge and outward expressions of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism since October 7th, 2025 has also seen, unsurprisingly, a corresponding surge in anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish propaganda. These anti-Jewish falsehoods, as I will henceforth refer to them, for such is what they are being broadly disseminated not only on the streets and in the various organs of popular culture, but also within the storied precincts of academia, where the pursuit of truth is ostensibly paramount. Students are indoctrinated by professors who, to the laud of an intellectually bankrupt chorus of their peers, filter the present existence and existential struggle of the world's only Jewish state through a lens of falsehoods based in ignorance, pseudo-scholarship, and commitment to an ideology or theology which is anti-Jewish at its core. Consistent with my own research proficiency, I will discuss in following three main areas in which the anti-Jewish narrative peddled by Palestinian exponents and their supporters seeks to undermine and ultimately erase the indigenous Jewish connection to the land of Israel. Drawing on both medieval Muslim Arabic sources as well as Near Eastern Jewish sources in both Hebrew and Arabic, I will demonstrate not only the falsity of the Palestinian narrative in these areas, but also how their deployment in that narrative is inconsistent even with the historical Muslim perspective. The first area that we'll consider is the undermining of the Jewish presence in the land. The most prevalent of the anti-Jewish falsehoods that I will here address, and the one most repeated by the anti-Zionist mobs in the city squares and university quads, is that the Jews in Israel are a colonial entity with no indigenous ties to the Middle East and North Africa, let alone the land of Israel into which they have intruded. This notion is reflected, for example, in the very title of Palestinian academic Mitri Reheb's pseudo-scholastic book titled Decolonizing Palestine, in which the Jewish people are portrayed as a malevolent foreign entity, tellingly subdivided in Reheb's index into only two groups, British and European, whose colonialist seizure of Palestine from its indigenous Arab inhabitants was largely fueled by naive Western Christian Zionists motivated by theologically romanticized notions of the ancient Holy Land. Reheb, by contrast, representing those whom he considers the indigenous people of the land, speaks in sentimental terms about his time as a youth visiting Jerusalem, which was for him a quote-unquote real city, where he would sit with friends on the Ottoman walls of the old city and snack happily on kek bread flavored with za'atar, that's wild thyme. In the same vein, I can speak in sentimental terms about my own time as a youth, spent among the leafy bowers and golden meadows of the Hudson Valley and Catskills, and how quote-unquote real those places were to me, with all of their vivid and varied sounds, colors, and scents. Yet this doesn't make me or my family indigenous Mohicans. Nor, by the same token, does any amount of mawkish reminiscence on the part of Reheb make him or his people indigenous to Judea. Of course, the presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel long predates that of any other existing ethnic group, including Arabs, the significant presence of whom in Israel only began with the Muslim conquest and colonization of the land in the 7th century CE. By any reasonable measure of indigeneity, this confirms the Jews as the preeminent indigenous people of the land. Certainly so, according to the collectively agreed upon qualifications of indigeneity adopted by the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, according to which one of the defining characteristics of indigeneity is, quote, historical continuity with pre-colonial and or pre-settler societies, unquote. Whether or not one requires such historical continuity to include residents in the land of claimed indigeneity, which is highly debatable, This makes no difference, since the Jewish people have maintained an unbroken presence in the land of Israel from antiquity. And according to the same UN Forum, another characteristic of indigeneity is, quote, self-identification as indigenous peoples at the individual level and accepted by the community as their member, unquote. Hence, according to this UN Forum at any rate, any individual born outside of Israel who self-identifies as a Jew and is accepted as such by the community of Jews which has maintained an unbroken presence in the land is part of the same indigenous group. As to the presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel in antiquity, this is as much of a historical truism as anything can be, confirmed by more historical evidence than can be found for most other claims of similar antiquity. Suffice it to say for our present purposes that the presence of the Jews in the land long before the military conquest and colonization of the land by Muslim Arabs is broadly recognized in the classical Muslim historiographical tradition. Information about the Jews, or Banu Israel, the children of Israel, in the land of Israel during the period covered by the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is found in the works of almost every major classical Arab historian, such as At-Tabari, Al-Mas'udi, Ibn Khaldun, and others. Reference to Jews in the land during this general period is also attested in the loose collection of narratives known as Israeliyat, found in Muslim folk tales, hadith collections, and classical commentaries on the Quran. In the Quran itself, moreover, the view is even found that God foreordained or destined, kataba, the land of Israel for the Jews. In Surah Al-Ma'idah, it says in verse 21, quote, and God is talking here, Allah, to the Jewish people, O people, enter the holy land that Allah has foreordained for you, unquote. Throughout these sources, the land of Israel is typically designated by the terms Al-Ard al-Muqaddasa, Balad Bait al-Maqdis, or simply Bait al-Maqdis, all of which are calques of Hebrew designations, as we will discuss later on. Another term found for the land is the Arabic term Asham, which also includes modern Lebanon, Syria, and Western Jordan. Far less common during this period is the term Filastin, or more precisely Jund Filastin, which comprised the southern military administrative district, or Jund, of Asham, encompassing Judea and most of Samaria, which is the Palestina Prima of the early Byzantine period. As to the continuing unbroken presence of Jews in the land of Israel throughout the medieval period of Islamic and sporadic Crusader rule, as well as the subsequent period of Ottoman rule, this is all richly documented in the carefully researched studies of scholars such as Moshe Gil, Jacob Mann, Eliyahu Ashtor, Yitzchak Ben Tzvi, among many others, drawing from an abundance of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources in various languages. Indeed, even in the Second Encyclopedia of Islam, Volume 2, published in 1965, the admission is made that, quote, Palestine had some Jewish inhabitants throughout the period of Islamic rule, unquote. Now, notwithstanding the notion of hundreds, perhaps, to which the term some might give rise, the Jewish population of the land of Israel during this period, while waxing and waning according to the ill or goodwill of the Muslim or Christian ruling class, was in fact quite significant. Although precise population numbers are generally difficult to come by, it can be conservatively estimated that the Jewish population of the land throughout the period of Muslim rule numbered in the tens of thousands. And in some places, the Jewish population even outnumbered that of Muslims. Thus, at the end of the 10th century, the Muslim geographer Shamsuddin al-Muqaddasi, a resident of Jerusalem, writes in his famous Ahsan al-Taqasim that the majority of the city's inhabitants were Christians and Jews, whereas, quote, the mosque is devoid of congregations and learned assemblies, unquote. On Purim of 1039 in Ramla, as described in a Judeo-Arabic letter written in that year by the Jewish communal leader Nathan ben Abraham, 400 Jewish men gathered in the main hall of one of the city's synagogues to engage in a collective reading of the scroll of Esther. From this, as reasonably observed by Moshe Gil, we can infer, quote, that there were approximately 1,000 Jewish families residing in the city, which is about 5,000 souls, unquote. Geniza documents reveal that in the early 9th century, Gaza had an important Jewish community, including, apparently, a center of study. For instance, we find reference to the Masorete Moses the Gazan around 800 CE. For its part, Tiberias in Galilee was one of the centers of worldwide Jewish scholarship, being the city to which the Sanhedrin had relocated after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, as well as the subsequent location of Yeshivat Gaon Yaakov, a direct outgrowth of the Sanhedrin and one of the 3 main yeshivot in the world at that time, until its relocation to Jerusalem towards the middle of the 10th century. Tiberias was also one of the main centers for the Masoretes, Jewish scholars who crystallized the reading and transmission of the Hebrew Bible. A word must be said about the Temple Mount, which, due to its preeminent religious and cultural significance, has served as one of the foundational landmarks linking the historical presence of the Jewish people to the land. Because of this, Palestinian exponents, from the PLO Mufti Ekrima Sabri to Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, have vehemently denied that there was ever any Jewish temple on the Temple Mount, or, as I'm sure you're aware, Har HaBayit, a biblical term which long predates Islam. The New York Times lent their own weight to this falsehood with an article published on October 8, 2015, titled, "Historical Certainty Proves Elusive at Jerusalem's Holiest Site." The writer of this article, Rick Gladstone, either with deceptive malice or extreme ignorance, went on to transfer the scholarly debate over the precise location on the Mount of the Heichal, or sanctuary, to the quote-unquote question, which he claimed many books and scholarly treatises have never answered, of whether there was ever a temple on the Mount at all. Of course, that the Temple Mount was the home of the Jewish temple is as much of a historical certainty as the site of the Greek Parthenon or the Roman Forum, and is accepted as such by all true scholars who merit the label, excepting the likes of such as Mitri Raheb, who in his aforementioned book reveals his absolute lack of scholarly bona fides by stating that, quote, "the phrase Temple Mount is used as a historical reference to where the Jewish temple might once have stood." In classical Muslim tradition, by contrast, the identity of the Temple Mount at the site of the Jewish temple is in fact well established. Hence, Abu Hassan al-Mas'udi, in the 9th and 10th century, asserts with not a shade of doubt in his Muruj al-Dhahab that, quote, "Solomon undertook the building of the Holy Temple, which is the Masjid al-Aqsa," unquote. Even more specifically, the great polyhistorian Abu Ja'far al-Tabari in the 9th and 10th century identifies the precise site of the Heichal as being a Sakhra, that is, the rock, upon which the later structure known as Qubat al-Sakhra, the Dome of the Rock, was built by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik towards the end of the 7th century. At-Tabari writes, on the authority of Wahab ben Munabih, a contemporary of Muhammad himself, quote, "David saw the angels with their swords drawn, sheathing them and climbing a golden ladder from a Sakhra to heaven. So David said, 'This is a site on which a place of worship ought to be built.' David intended to begin its construction, but God said to him via revelation, 'This is a holy sanctuary,' or Bait al-Maqdis in Arabic, 'and you have stained your hands with blood. Therefore you cannot be its builder, but rather it will be a son of yours whom I will make king after you, whom I will name Solomon and preserve from bloodshed.' Thus, when Solomon became king, he built it and ennobled it." In other words, he built the Heichal on the site of As-Sakhra, where the Dome of the Rock currently resides. Our second area is the undermining of Jewish identity. The primary claim deployed by Palestinian exponents to undermine Jewish identity is the scholastically debunked Khazar theory, which entails that the Khazars, a nomadic Turkic people group that was situated in the area between and to the north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, converted to Judaism in the late 8th or early 9th century, and following the fall of the Khazar Empire in the latter half of the 10th century, emigrated to Europe, where they established themselves as the ancestors or core of Ashkenazi Jewry. As noted by Yehoshaphat Harkavi in his 1972 book, which I highly recommend, by the way, a criminally underused resource for anyone who comments on the current conflict, his 1972 book, Arab Attitudes to Israel, he pointed out this claim, this Khazar theory, was then already being broadly peddled in the Arab world as an ideological weapon targeting the legitimacy of the State of Israel. And this is especially true among the Palestinians, where this claim has been given vociferous traction by the political leadership, including PA President Mahmoud Abbas, religious leaders, and the popular media. Right out of the gate, I would point out that despite its sloppy application by Palestinian exponents to all Israeli Jews, this claim has absolutely no bearing on the majority of them, who are descended not from Ashkenazi Jews, but from Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews, who have an established and well-documented history in the Middle East and Mediterranean basin, including the land of Israel, as discussed in the previous section. As for the application of this theory to Ashkenazi Jewry, the Khazar theory has been soundly disproven by the meticulous work of manifold scholars and scientists. The main reasons for its rejection may be summed up as follows. Number one, the unreliability of the few sources that mention the Khazars' supposed Jewishness. The primary sources that mention the Jewishness of the Khazars, whether just of the king and his court or the people as well, comprise 2 Hebrew documents and a handful of references in Muslim Arabic works, which were either contemporaneous with the Khazar Empire or composed soon after it was conquered by Sviatoslav of Rus around 970 CE. The 2 Hebrew documents, one a letter by the supposed king of the Khazars to the prominent Andalusian Jew Chasdai ben Shaprut, and the other an anonymous historical account of the Khazars' supposed conversion, contradict each other and have been rightly judged to be pseudepigraphal. Whereas the handful of Muslim references, contemporary Muslim references to the Khazars' Jewishness, have all been shown to be based on rumor and hearsay, and on their face are in fact quite questionable, such as the 10th century geographer Ali Stakhri's statement in his Kitab al-Masalik, quote, "The Khazars are Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and among them also are idolaters. The least numerous of the groups is the Jews, and the most numerous is the Muslims, despite the fact that the king and his retinue are Jews," unquote. Ibn Rustah, in the early 10th century, another one of these sources, admits that for his knowledge of distant places, he had to rely on sources and information transmitted by persons of questionable reliability. Number 2, the silence of most other sources regarding the Khazars' supposed conversion. Now, this silence is of several types. First, the silence on this topic when mentioning the Khazars by most other classical Muslim historians and geographers, most others, including some of the most highly respected among them, such as Ibn Qutayba, al-Baladhari, at-Tabari, Ibn Atham al-Kufi, Ibn al-Faqih, and others. Indeed, the only first-hand account of a visitor to the Khazar kingdom, namely that of Salam the interpreter, who was sent by the Abbasid Caliph al-Wathiq in 842 to search for the mythical wall of Alexander. In his memoirs, no mention at all is made of the Khazars' Jewishness. And al-Muqaddasi, who actually visited Itil, the former capital of the Khazar Empire, less than 15 years after its conquest, found many Muslims there, but no Jewish Khazars. A second type of silence is that of contemporary Jewish sources, in particular the Geonim, or heads, of the 2 yeshivot in Iraq. For 200 years, from 750 to 950 CE, during the heyday of the Khazar Empire, there is not one reference in the Teshuvot or responsa literature of the Geonim, both of Surah and Pumbeditha, 30 Geonim of Surah and 35 of Pumbeditha, not one reference to a Jewish empire ruled or populated by Jewish Khazars. Even more, according to a note by Ibn Khawqal, a Muslim historian, on a map in his Kitab Surat al-Ard, the great Andalusian Jew Chastai ibn Shaprut eventually traveled to Khazariya, since he was keenly interested in this notion of a supposed Jewish kingdom. Yet we have no records from Chastai ibn Shaprut coming out of those travels that he found any Jews or Jewish kingdom in the land of the Khazars. And this is quite deafening because, again, he was keenly interested in this issue. Another silence is that of Christian and other sources. The Byzantine state maintained significant ties with the Khazars, yet no Byzantine work refers to their Jewishness, nor do any early Russian, early Georgian, Armenian, Bulgarian, or Syriac writers mention the Jewishness of the Khazars, where one would reasonably expect them to do so. And another type of silence is that of archaeology, as summed up by Professor Shaul Stamper. Quote, in addition to this broad textual silence, there is no material evidence for the conversion of the Khazars to Judaism, or even for the presence of a significant Jewish community in Khazar lands, unquote. 3, the absence of any onomastic or more generally linguistic elements linking Ashkenazi Jewry to the Khazars. Simply put, neither the names nor the Yiddish language common to Ashkenazi Jewry exhibit any influence of Central Asian languages, to which the language of the Khazars, now long gone, would belong. Indeed, the fundamentally Germanic nature of Yiddish, spoken by Jewish communities in Europe and the interior of Russia, including places much further east than the former Khazar kingdom, bears out the veracity of the long-accepted scholarly view that Ashkenazi Jewry arose through migration up the Italian peninsula into the trading cities of the Rhine Valley, where, after adopting the German stock of Yiddish, they eventually branched out into Europe and eastward into Russia. 4th, contemporary references to fundamentally non-Jewish practices among the supposedly Jewish Khazars. An example of one such reference is found in the earliest known systematic Jewish commentary on the Book of Esther, composed around 935 by Saadia ben Yosef, the Gaon, or head, of the great yeshiva in Sura, Iraq, and also one of the leading Jewish scholars of the medieval period. In order to corroborate the reality of Haman, a mere man, being portrayed in the Book of Esther, chapter 3, verse 2, as an object of worship, he cites from that part of the world the example of the contemporary Khazars, writing that, quote, before the man of the best qualities among them, they do indeed prostrate themselves and worship him. As he says in Arabic, yasjudu lahu wa yabudunahu. And they call him, he goes on, by the name Hakan, notwithstanding that they set up another one in his place as time goes on, unquote. In other words, though the Hakan, which is the throne name of the Khazar king, even though he's clearly mortal, he is worshipped as divine. Thus, about 150 years after their supposed conversion to Judaism, the Khazars are described by the foremost scholar of the closest large Jewish community to Khazariya as engaging in a fundamentally non-Jewish practice, entailing, in fact, one of the 3 gravest sins in Judaism. 5, the genetic evidence closely linking Ashkenazi Jewry to Mizrahi and Sephardi Jewry, and the lack of such linking them to the Khazars. Proponents of the Khazar view broadly cite as their quote-unquote scientific proof a paper published in 2012 by Aaron Al-Haik, in which he claimed a genetic link between the Khazars and East European Jewry. However, his study has been roundly rejected by the majority of geneticists because of several severe methodological flaws. including his use of Caucasus Armenians and Georgians as DNA proxies for the long-gone Khazars, despite there being no proven link between these groups. By contrast, the work on Jewish genome history by other researchers, including some of the field's leading geneticists, such as Harry Ostrer, Michael Hammer, Gilad Tzmon, and Doron Behar, has consistently confirmed the conclusion that, as expressed by Doron Behar in a 2013 paper encompassing the work of an international team of 30 scientists, quote, Ashkenazi Jews share the greatest genetic ancestry with other Jewish populations, and there is no indication of a significant genetic contribution either from within or from north of the Caucasus region, unquote. 6. Jewish communities already existed in Europe before the fall and supposed dispersal of the Khazars. As discussed by my own late Dr. Vater, Norman Golb, among others, the Carolingian Empire, encompassing most of Western and Central Europe in the 9th century, had 3 main Jewish community seats, each one for the so-called Rex Judaeorum, one in Mainz, or Mogontium, Rouen, or Rodomagus, and Narbonne. From the early 10th century, we also have Geniza correspondence between Chasdaya ben Shavrut and the Kehilot Franza, which term, Franza, at that time denoted the lands of the Carolingian Empire, also discussed by Golb. Notwithstanding all that we have said above, even if there was some partial genetic link between the Khazars and Ashkenazi Jewry, this would not matter, since the borders of Jewish ethnicity have always been permeable to inclusion via conversion. This qualification of ethnicity, I would reiterate, has also been affirmed by the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which, as I noted above, asserts that one of the defining characteristics of indigeneity is, quote, self-identification as indigenous peoples at the individual level and accepted by the community as their member, unquote. Hence, the theoretical infusion of Khazar DNA into the collective Jewish genome would have no more bearing on the issue of collective Jewish indigeneity to the land of Israel than the actual infusion of Arab DNA into the collective Egyptian genome has on the issue of collective Egyptian indigeneity to Egypt, which reasoning incidentally applies to the indigenous claims of many other ethnic groups conquered and colonized by Arab Muslims. No doubt recognizing the weakness of their claims against the historical continuity of Jewish identity and attendant indigeneity to the land, Palestinian exponents have also claimed descent from competing ancient indigenous groups. Mahmoud Abbas and others have at various points claimed that the Palestinians descend from the Philistines, generally identified as an Aegean people, likely of Indo-European origin, as well as descended from the Canaanites, a Hamitic people group distinct from the Philistines. And some Palestinian exponents have even claimed that they are the true descendants of the ancient Israelites, which claim they complement by categorically applying the Khazar theory to contemporary Jews. However, insofar as the Palestinians identify as Arabs, these patently ridiculous claims contradict the universally affirmed classical Arab Muslim tradition that Arabs are descended from Abraham's son, Ishmael. Moreover, these names contradict the ethno-geographic tradition of contemporary Palestinian Arabs themselves as reflected in their nisab, or gentilic surnames. For example, Al-Masri means from Egypt, an especially common surname among Gazan Arabs. Al-Khawrani means from Khawran in Syria. Al-Khalabi means from Khalab or Aleppo. As-Surani means from Sur, that is Tyre in Lebanon. As-Saidawi means from Saida or Sidon in Lebanon. A-Trablusi means from Trablus, Tripoli, in Lebanon. Al-Hijazi means from the Hijaz in the Arabian Peninsula. Al-Karaki means from Al-Karak in Jordan. Azarqawi means from Zarqa in Jordan. Al-Iraqi, of course, from Iraq. al-Fayoumi from Fayoum in Egypt, etc., etc. Our third and final area is the undermining of Jewish toponymy. This entails the claim that most of the Hebrew place names used by Israelis are applied to places with pre-existing Arabic names so as to enforce the Jews' colonialist claims. As Palestinian academic Mitri Raheb says, quote, "Naming is a means to exercise power, to claim dominance over land and people, and it constitutes an important aspect of settler colonial projects," unquote. This point may well be true, but its application is not in the direction that Raheb intends. The Israelis' use of Hebrew names for pre-Islamic places is, in fact, a decolonizing endeavor focused on the pre-existing names supplanted by Arabic ones following the Muslim settler colonial project that began in the 7th century. There are some genuine Arabic names for places in the land of Israel, either for places founded during the period of Islamic dominion, such as Ramla, which name, by the way, as I'm sure most of you are aware, Israelis retain in Hebrew without the article, or Arabic place names as alternatives to pre-existing Hebrew and Aramaic names, such as Al-Khalil for biblical Hebron or Hebron, which latter, as affirmed by the early 13th century Muslim geographer Yaqut Darumi, among several other classical Arab sources, is the original name, or Ism al-Asli, as he says, of that city. Yet most of the Arabic names for pre-Islamic places represent, in fact, different pronunciations of the pre-existing Hebrew or Aramaic names, just like the Arabicized Hebrew names Ismail, Ibrahim, Ishaq, Yaqub, and most of the other prophets in Islam. Thus, for example, Beit Lachem is Beit Lechem, Batir is Beitar, Asqalan is Ashkelon, Safad is Tzafat, Aricha or Richa is Yericho, Yibna is Yavne, Beit Jibrin is Beit Guvrin, Jinin is Ein Ganim, mentioned in Joshua, Tuqua is Tekoa, Saphuriya is Tzipori, Sepphoris, Tulkarm is Turkarma, mentioned in the Talmud and other early sources. Al-Majdal is Magdala in Aramaic, also known as Migdal Nunaya, and the list goes on and on. Especially instructive are the variety of names used for Jerusalem by medieval Arabic authors. Among the pre-Islamic poets and Arabs in the early generations of Islam, as noted by the great Muslim geographer Abu Ubaid al-Bakri in the 11th century in his Mujam Mastajama, the city was known by the names Ilia, from the Latin name Aelia Capitolina, to which Hadrian had renamed Jerusalem, the Emperor Hadrian, for the same reason that he renamed Judea to Palestina following the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 136. We also find the name Tzion or Tzihyun, obviously from Hebrew Tzion. We also find the name Shalom, Shalim, or Salim, from Hebrew Shalem. And another name for Jerusalem, well attested in the classical Arab sources, is represented by various Arabicized pronunciations of Hebrew Yerushalayim and Aramaic Yerushalem. These various Arabic transliterations being, for instance, Urshalim, Urishalim, Urshalam, etc. And there's several other variations. Nor was the Jewish origin of this latter name lost on classical Muslim writers, as Yaqut Darumi remarks in his Geographical Dictionary in his entry on Urishalim and its variant pronunciations. He writes, quote, "This is a name for Beit al-Maqdis in Hebrew, unquote. This clearly gives the lie to Nur Masalcha's claim, made in his recent book Palestine, A 4,000-Year History, published in 2018, that the name Urshalim was coined by Israel in 1967 as a quote-unquote new word in order to replace the proper Arabic name Al-Quds on road signs as part of Israel's nefarious settler colonial plan of Judaization. Masalcha could easily have verified the currency of the name Urshalim in classical Arabic sources via recourse to Yaqut, the classical geographer, or even the Second Encyclopedia of Islam in the entry on Al-Quds. Yet instead he chose to cite and rely on an article posted on the viciously anti-Semitic and unscholarly website, the Electronic Intifada. Among the two most prevalent names for Jerusalem in the Arabic sources are Beit al-Maqdis and, mainly from the 11th century, Al-Quds, which later name eventually came to replace all others. Both of these names, as I mentioned earlier on in my presentation, are in fact abbreviated calques, that is to say, literal loan translations of earlier Hebrew and Jewish Aramaic designations for the city that specifically reference the Jewish temple. Beit al-Maqdis is an abbreviation of Madinat Beit al-Maqdis, which is a calque of Hebrew Ir Beit HaMikdash and Aramaic Karta de Beit Makdasha, both of which literally mean the city of the house of the sanctuary, in which the house of the sanctuary refers to the temple. As to the name Al-Quds, this, for its own part, is an abbreviation of Madinat Al-Quds, which is a calque of Hebrew Ir HaKodesh and Aramaic Karta de Kudsha, both of which literally mean the city of holiness, in which the specific reference of Kodesh or Kudsha is to the temple, that is the place of holiness par excellence. Further affirming the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of these two names is the observation that, unlike the Hebrew and Aramaic root Kadash, the cognate Arabic root, Qadasa, is not the normative Arabic root employed in Muslim Arabic to denote a sanctuary or the idea of sacredness/holiness. For this, Muslim writers employ the root Harama, as in the designation of Mecca as Al-Masjid al-Haram, the sacred mosque, or as in the designation now employed for the Temple Mount, Al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, which latter expression, by the way, as noted in the article on it in the Second Encyclopedia of Islam, was still not considered proper for that site, Al-Haram al-Sharif, that term, even in the 14th century, and, quote, would seem to have been imposed by popular usage rather than by full agreement on the unified holiness of the area, unquote. As regards this last point, finally, I would point out that the holiness, or hurma in Arabic, of the Temple Mount, and hence its designation as a haram, or sanctuary, holy place, let alone al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, is nowhere mentioned in the Quran, nor is this an attested dogma of early Islam. For several generations, it was even debated among early Islamic scholars whether the expression al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the furthermost mosque, in the Quran, in fact referred to the Temple Mount at all, which on the face of it certainly does not seem to fit with the description of the land of Israel elsewhere in the Quran as Adna al-Ard, the very near land. Nor did the eventual consensus among Muslim scholars that this Quranic mosque is to be identified with the Temple Mount automatically translate into its status as a haram, or a holy site. Even at the beginning of the 14th century CE, the great theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, known as Shaykh al-Islam, the elder of Islam, decidedly rejects the notion that there is any haram, that is holy site, in the land of Israel. He writes in a special treatise devoted to exaggerated popular Muslim claims about Jerusalem and the land of Israel. There is no place in Jerusalem, he calls it Beit al-Maqdis, designated by Allah as a holy site, Haram, nor at the burial site of Abraham in Hebron, nor in any other location except for 3 places in total. In other words, according to Islamic dogma at that time, there are only 3 places designated by Haram. The first is a holy site, a Haram, according to the unanimous agreement of all Muslims, which is the holy site of Mecca. The second is a holy site, according to the multitude of scholars, which is the holy site of the Prophet, Medina. And the third is Wedj, which is a valley in Taif. It's a city in the Hijaz. He says this is a holy site, a Haram, according to a Shafi'i, but not according to most scholars. There is not one Muslim scholar who claims a holy site, a Haram, beyond these 3 places. It was only after the view of the Temple Mount as an Islamic holy site, that is, Al-Haram al-Sharif, became entrenched in popular Islamic dogma during the Ottoman period from the 16th century, that the view of the site as the quote-unquote third holiest in Islam would eventually gain ubiquitous traction among both Muslims and therefore non-Muslims. This view of the site as Islam's third holiest was promoted in particular by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and Nazi ally, Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, who, in the interest of promoting this notion in his propaganda war against the Jews, commissioned the renovation of Qubat al-Sakhra, that's the Dome of the Rock, and the mosque at the southern end of the mount, the dilapidated state of both of which hardly bespoke of treatment as an Islamic holy site, let alone the third holiest in all of Islam. Since then, this view has been regularly deployed by Palestinian exponents and others ignorant of the view's history as an inherently equal or even superior counterpoint to the view of the site as Judaism's holiest, which of course is rooted in biblical antiquity. In conclusion, in each of the 3 areas that we've addressed briefly, the unbroken Jewish presence in the land of Israel, the historical continuity of Jewish identity, and the antiquity of Jewish toponymy, a careful examination of the data reveals that the Palestinian narrative, which would deny these things to the Jewish people and apply them instead to the descendants of the Arab Muslims who colonized and gradually migrated to the Jewish homeland over the last 1,400 years, is in fact an inversion of reality. There are many academics who know the truth about these things. Some of them, however, have chosen to sacrifice their consciences and place their commitment to a morally bankrupt and ultimately anti-Semitic ideology before truth. To these I say simply, shame on you. You have allied yourselves with the harbingers of true academia's demise. Other scholars have been cowed and bullied into silence by a growing chorus of their anti-Zionist peers, fearful of being branded with a blue Z, the new scarlet letter of establishment censure. To these latter, I repeat the moral admonition of the 1st century Galilean sage Yaakov Bar Yosef, quote, "Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin," unquote. Now is the time for you to add your voice to those fighting back against the Goliath of collective falsehoods deployed by modern-day Philistines to undermine and erase the indigenous connection of the Jewish people to their land. Thank you.
Now you get to be interrogated.
So I'm running second.
Questions?
Yep.
Yes, please.
Thank you for a very in-depth presentation, and I think a vital one. You basically provide quite a comprehensive analysis of the attempt by Palestinianism at cultural erasure of Jewish indigeneity in the land of Israel. I wonder if you would care to comment how that interfaces with a greater cultural, economic, neo-imperialism, pan-Arabism, which really is not only our roots here, but Kurds and numerous other people, Copts, Nubians, etc., in the MENA region.
Well, that's an important question. My forte is not in modern Arabic studies, but in classical, Jewish Arabic, Muslim Arabic. So I can't give you an expert answer on that, but one who can, a good source that can, is the book I mentioned in my presentation by Yehoshaphat Harkabi, Arab Attitudes to Israel. I cannot recommend that enough. It's his doctoral dissertation, translated into Arabic, his doctoral dissertation from Hebrew University, based on his reading of hundreds and hundreds of Arab books, pamphlets, written sources, and listening to hundreds of audio sources. And he addresses that issue in detail. How anti-Israelism among the Arabs is tied into the issue of their opposition to imperialism, and how that ties into their opposition to Zionism, as a daughter of imperialism. And he gets into all of that in great detail. And I would simply recommend, I don't mean to divert your question, but I can't give you an expert answer on the modern attitude or issue of pan-Arabism. I mean, other than what I can see just from a popular perspective. But again, my academic forte, and from which I would feel comfortable giving you an answer, is in the medieval realm, where opposition to Jewish indigeneity isn't as strong as it is today, simply because the Jews didn't have their own independent state, and so Israel didn't represent, or the Jewish people, for whom Israel is their national home, didn't represent the thorn in the eye of Islam that it does today, according to fundamental Muslim theology holds that any lands brought under the banner of Islam, Dar al-Islam, remains forever, the waqf, the possession of the Muslim. And so Israel is, quite a novelty in reclaiming land that was brought under the banner of Islam and thriving, and really representing an ongoing testimony to what I would call the impotence of Allah. According to classical Islamic theology, of course, they have ways of explaining that, through the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is an immensely popular work in the Arab world and has been ever since it came out, essentially. They have ways of explaining Israel's success and why they were able to reclaim land that was once that of the Muslim. Any explanation other than the obvious one, but again, as to your question, I would steer you to Harkabi's book. I cannot recommend it enough. Anyone who comments on, talks about, or discusses the modern issue, the conflict between Israel, the Palestinians, the Arab world in general, needs to read that book. All of his conclusions hold true times 2. Absolutely. I cannot recommend it enough. Yes? Yeah.
What was the general thought in the pre-Inquisition during the Caliphate of Cordoba? What was the Arabic thought in relationship to the Jews in the diaspora and Jerusalem specifically?
That's a good question. As I mentioned just a second ago, it didn't get much thought in his official Islamic theology and discussion, because the Jews didn't have their own state, and the notion that they ever would reacquire one doesn't seem to have been on the radar of most Muslim theologians and writers. So they were a dhimmi people. They were tolerated as inferiors. It wasn't modern tolerance by any stretch. They were a tolerated group of inferiors, and the notion that they would ever form some kind of political rival or powerful competitor to Islam just wasn't on the radar. It was a non-issue. It was a non-issue. Yeah, and Cordoba is an interesting sort of exception, historically speaking, that Chasdaev and Shaprut and other Jews were able to thrive and do so well and attain such high position. Certainly not the norm. certainly not the norm in the Arab world, despite what you hear in the popular media, even in academia today about, the golden age of tolerance. It's absolutely untrue. Yeah, compared to Christian Europe, it might have been somewhat better, but that doesn't mean it was good for the Jew. Absolutely not. There were regular pogroms, persecutions, severe oppression, oppressive taxation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So.
I think we have time for one more. Well, we'll do two more.
Okay, last one. Can we get a copy or listen to it on the internet? This was a very, very interesting and influential presentation. We want to watch it on the internet.
I'm happy to make the paper available. For everything I said, I have copious references. And I'm happy to email the paper, today to anyone who wants it, because in my footnotes, I don't just give the written references, but I have links there too to, I talked about Mahmoud Abbas claiming that Palestinians descend from the Philistines or the Canaanites, or, promoting the Khazar theory. I have links to the video clips. So if anyone is interested and wants that now, I'm happy to email my paper. Yeah, that's...
Last.
Reference to the Khazar theory. I'm familiar with your research. The question is, what about, or how do you justify the Khuzari, who the lady apparently wrote to them, to the Khazar king, right?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Khuzari. In other words, Khuzari was intended as a
Right.
savior to the Khazar kingdom.
You're talking about Judah Halevi's book?
Yes, correct.
Right, that, it was most scholars would agree it was a fictitious setting for a theologically polemical work to demonstrate the superiority of Judaism. I mean, this notion of a Khazar kingdom in his day, of a Jewish Khazar kingdom, it was, Chasdai ibn Shaprut heard of it. That's why, according to Ibn Khalkal, he actually traveled there, though he left us no records about having found any kind of Jewish kingdom. This sort of fanciful mythological rumor had reached the ears, obviously, of Jewish people elsewhere in the Middle East, including Yehuda Halevi, and formed, a perfect sort of mold for what he wanted to write and discuss in that book. But most scholars would agree it's not based on any historical truth. It's a fictitious framework to present the truth of Judaism's superiority compared to the other options.
One more.
How does Islamic theology square the fact that the Quran says that Allah promised this land to Jews versus what you said about once they conquered land, it's theirs?
Right. Well, obviously, they have to explain that statement away. There's always a way to explain things away, obviously, that you don't like or agree with. And the simple answer would be that originally he gave it to them, but it was temporary. They lost it because, of their behavior or whatever other evils that the Muslim theologians ascribed to the Jews. So it was originally, ordained for them, but they lost their right to it.
So then the Quran is not an eternal document. The Quran itself is changeable.
Well, they would say, as they say about so many verses in the Quran, some applied for a time and others, pick it up thereafter. Some are from this period in Medina, others are from the Mecca period. Some are giving eternal prescripts and, theological dogmas, others are temporary. So yeah, that particular statement of God was superseded. Sure. My forte, again, I did the research I did for this paper, but my forte is not Islamic commentary. I'm just giving you sort of a general answer. There might be other nuanced ways they explain that, but my focus is in medieval Jewish commentary, Judeo-Arabic commentary, so I only have so much time and brain power to give these days. But yeah.
Thank you.